Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your favorite pillow, and let's just settle in. Tonight, we're going to talk about a secret that stayed buried under the dirt for over 5 centuries, right up until a very lucky accident and a very mundane parking lot changed everything we thought we knew. It's a story about a man who was a king, a villain, a brother, and eventually just a skeleton with a very crooked spine. So take a deep breath, relax, and let's float back to 1485. History, as it turns out, is written by the winners, and the winners really didn't like Richard III. If you've read any Shakespeare, you probably picture Richard as this literal monster, a hunchbacked, withered-armed villain who spent his free time plotting the demise of small children. But reality is always a bit more beige. Richard was just another royal in a family tree that looked more like a dense, tangled thicket than a tree. He was part of the House of York, and if you know anything about the Wars of the Roses, you know it was basically a decades-long HR nightmare. So Richard dies at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He's the last English king to die in battle, which sounds impressive until you realize he died because he charged straight at Henry Tudor and got his skull cleaved open. Henry became Henry VII, started the Tudor dynasty, and promptly began a massive PR campaign to make sure everyone remembered Richard as a half-baked potato of a human being. Richard was buried in a hurry at Greyfriars Church in Leicester. No grand tomb, no golden statues, just a hole in the ground for the loser of the war. And then time did what it does. The church was torn down during the Reformation because Henry VIII needed more money for his various hobbies. The location of the grave was lost. For 500 years, people walked over Richard without knowing it. They built houses, then they tore them down. Eventually, the spot where a king of England lay resting became a social services parking lot, because of course it did. There is something beautifully ironic about a medieval monarch spending half a millennium under a designated spot for a Vauxhall Corsa. In 2012, a group of historians and archaeologists who were probably told they were wasting their time decided to dig. They had a hunch, and on the very first day, within the first few hours, they hit bone. Now, usually archaeology is a slow, agonizing process of brushing dirt off a broken pot shard for 6 months. But here, they struck gold, or, well, they struck Richard. As they cleared away the dirt, a few things became immediately clear. First, the guy definitely had scoliosis. His spine curved like a question mark. He wasn't a hunchback in the Disney villain sense, but one shoulder was definitely higher than the other. He was small, delicate, and despite the Tudor propaganda, he actually had quite a refined face. He looked less like a monster and more like a tired accountant who had seen too many spreadsheets. The DNA testing was the real kicker. They tracked down a living descendant, a furniture maker in Canada, of all places, and the match was perfect. It was him. The usurper, the crookback, the man who allegedly locked his nephews in a tower and threw away the key. He had been sitting under Bay 1 of a parking lot while the world moved on. But Richard is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to royal secrets buried in the dirt. You see, the European royals had a very specific way of doing things. They like to keep things in the family. And when you keep things in the family for 500 years, the family tree stops branching and starts looking like a ladder. Let's float over to another royal disaster, shall we? If Richard III was the king found in a parking lot, our next friend was a king who probably should have stayed in the palace, but his genetics had other plans. We're moving from the muddy fields of Leicester to the sun-drenched yet deeply dysfunctional court of the Spanish Habsburgs. If you've ever seen a painting of a Habsburg, you've noticed the jaw. It wasn't just a chin, it was a structural hazard. And no one embodied the peak of this genetic oopsie more than Charles II of Spain. They called him El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because naturally, in the 17th century, if a king can't chew his own food or speak clearly, it's not because his parents were first cousins. It's definitely a magic spell cast by a disgruntled neighbor. Charles was the result of generations of strategic marriages.
His father was his mother's uncle. His grandmother was also his aunt. By the time Charles arrived in 1661, his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if two siblings had a child. He was literally more inbred than a purebred pug. And he looked the part. Imagine, if you will, a king whose lower jaw protruded so far forward that his top and bottom teeth couldn't meet. He couldn't masticate. He just sort of swallowed things whole like a seagull. His tongue was so large that he drooled constantly and struggled to be understood. But because he was the king of Spain, everyone just nodded along like he was dropping pearls of wisdom instead of saliva. The poor guy didn't walk until he was almost 6. He wasn't expected to live past infancy, but he defied the odds, mostly out of spite and the sheer exhaustion of the Spanish court. He was treated like a glass doll. He wasn't allowed to learn anything too difficult because they were afraid his brain would melt. He spent his days playing with dwarves and being terrified of his own shadow. The irony here is that while Charles was physically and mentally falling apart, he presided over one of the most powerful empires on earth. It was a slow-motion car crash that lasted 39 years. The ambassadors from other countries would visit the court, take one look at Charles, and immediately go home to write letters saying, "Yeah, this guy is definitely going to die next Tuesday. Get the armies ready." But Charles just kept lingering. He got married twice. The first wife, Marie Louise of Orleans, was reportedly horrified when she met him. She spent years trying to produce an heir, but Charles was perhaps mercifully sterile. When she died, the court replaced her with Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was basically a professional bulldozer of a woman. She ran the court, sold government offices, and spent most of her time screaming at the king. Charles's health was a constant topic of conversation. He had chronic diarrhea, frequent bouts of fever, and a general sense of, "I'd rather be anywhere else." Toward the end of his life, he became obsessed with his ancestors. He actually had the royal tombs at the Escorial opened so he could look at the rotting corpses of his family. He even insisted on lying down next to them, because why not double down on the morbid vibes when you're already the living embodiment of a genetic dead end? When he finally died in 1700, the autopsy report was a journey. The physician claimed his body contained not a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his head was full of water. While medically impossible, it paints a vivid picture of a man who was essentially a ghost before he even stopped breathing. His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession because he didn't have an heir, and everyone wanted a piece of the Spanish pie. It's a classic royal trope. One man's inability to produce a child leads to half of Europe burning down, all because two cousins liked each other a little too much. But while Charles was the tragic end of a line, the weirdness wasn't limited to Spain. Let's drift across the map to a place where the royals were less bewitched and more eccentric in a way that involves a lot of very tall soldiers. Now settle back in. We're moving to Prussia. Meet Friedrich William I. They called him the Soldier King. You'd think a man obsessed with the military would like, fighting wars. But Friedrich William hated war. He just liked the aesthetic of an army. Specifically, he liked very tall men. Friedrich William had a thing for giants. He created a regiment known as the Potsdam Grands, or the Grand Grenadiers. To get into this club, you had to be at least 6 feet 2 inches tall, which in the 1700s made you a literal titan. He didn't care if you could shoot a gun or follow a command. He just wanted you to be tall. He was so obsessed that he would kidnap tall men from all over Europe. He'd pay bounties to people who found tall peasants. He even tried to breed them by forcing tall men to marry tall women, effectively running a proto-eugenics program because he wanted a battalion of super soldiers that he never actually intended to use in battle. When he was depressed, which was often, he would have his giants march through his bedroom to cheer him up. He'd dress them in high caps to make them look even taller and just watch them. It was his version of a sensory lamp. The sad part of this story is his son, Friedrich the Great. Friedrich the Great was a sensitive kid. He liked French literature, the flute, and not being yelled at. His father, the soldier king, hated all of those things. He thought the flute was effeminate, and French books were a sign of weakness. He treated his son with a level of cruelty that would make a modern therapist's head spin. When Friedrich tried to run away to England with a close friend and likely lover named Hans Hermann von Katte, they were caught. The king's reaction wasn't a "go to your room." It was, "I'm going to execute your friend in front of your window and force you to watch." And he did. Friedrich fainted before the sword fell, but the damage was done. He spent the rest of his life being the great king his father wanted, but he was cold, cynical, and preferred the company of his greyhounds to any human being. He became one of the greatest military tacticians in history, but he did it with a heart that had been effectively turned to stone by a man who just wanted to play with giant soldiers. It's an ironic
So let's leave the tall soldiers of Prussia behind and drift into a different kind of royal fragility. We've talked about bones and jaws, but what about a king who thought he was made of glass? Enter Charles VI of France. He started out with the nickname Charles the Beloved because at the beginning of his reign he was actually quite competent. He was handsome, athletic, and well-liked. But in 1392, something in his mind just snapped. He was out riding with his army on a particularly hot day when a page accidentally dropped a lance. The clang of the metal hitting the ground triggered a psychotic break. Charles drew his sword and killed several of his own knights before he was finally wrestled to the ground. From that moment on, the Beloved became Charles the Mad. His delusions were varied and honestly a bit poetic in their sadness. At one point, he forgot he was king. He forgot he had a wife and children. He would run through the halls of the palace until he collapsed from exhaustion. But his most famous delusion was the glass delusion. He became convinced that he was made of glass and would shatter into 1,000 pieces if anyone touched him. He had his clothes reinforced with iron ribs so he wouldn't break. He wrapped himself in thick blankets and sat perfectly still for hours, terrified that a sudden movement or a clumsy servant would end his life. He eventually refused to bathe or change his clothes for 5 months because the risk of shattering during a scrub-down was just too high. Imagine the smell of a medieval palace combined with a king who hasn't seen soap since the previous season. It's not exactly the divine right of kings vibe you see in the movies. And while Charles was worrying about his structural integrity, his family tree was preparing a much more literal blood-related disaster further east. Let's float over to Russia, to the Romanovs. If the Habsburgs were the kings of the jaw, the Romanovs were the kings of the golden blood, otherwise known as hemophilia. This is where the secret buried in the dirt comes back around, but in a much more tragic way. Nicholas II was the last Tsar of Russia. He was a man who was deeply devoted to his family and almost entirely unqualified to run a country during a revolution. He was a nice guy in a position that required a shark. But the real shadow over his reign wasn't the Bolsheviks, it was his son, Alexei. Alexei had hemophilia, passed down through his mother, Alexandra, who was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the ultimate carrier of the royal malady. In an age before modern medicine, a simple bruise for Alexei could mean weeks of agonizing internal bleeding. A bumped knee was a national crisis. This secret was kept under total lockdown. The Russian people had no idea their future czar was essentially a glass child of a different sort. This desperation drove Alexandra into the arms of Grigory Rasputin, a holy man who smelled like a goat and had the personal hygiene of a swamp, but who somehow managed to stop Alexei's bleeding when the doctors couldn't. Because why not have a mysterious, semi-literate Siberian mystic running your government while the world falls apart? It's the classic royal move. When in doubt, find a wizard. We know how this ends. The revolution came, the family was taken to a basement in Yekaterinburg, and they vanished. For decades, the Soviet government maintained that the bodies were destroyed, and rumors swirled that the youngest daughter, Anastasia, or even Alexei himself had escaped. It wasn't until 1991, and then later in 2007, that the dirt finally gave up its secrets. In a shallow grave in the woods, researchers found the remains.
Through DNA testing, similar to the kind used for Richard III, they confirmed that the entire family had been there all along. No one escaped. The Grand Duchess was just a collection of bone fragments in a forest. There's a quiet, heavy irony in it. These people lived in palaces of gold and marble, convinced of their own divine importance, only to end up as a mystery buried in a muddy pit, solved by scientists in lab coats decades later. Part 5. The Queen Who Was a King and the Breakfast of Chaos. Let's drift north now, away from the tragic basements of Russia and toward the snowy, slightly confused court of 17th century Sweden. We need to talk about Christina. She was the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, a man so masculine he basically smelled like gunpowder and pine needles. He wanted a son. He got Christina. When she was born, the midwives actually thought she was a boy because she was so hairy and had a large, harsh voice. When they realized their mistake, they were terrified to tell the king. But Gustavus, surprisingly, just shrugged and said, "She's going to be clever. She's already fooled us all." He decided to raise her exactly like a prince. Christina grew up to be one of the most brilliant, eccentric, and utterly done-with-it monarchs in history. She hated feminine things. She refused to wear elaborate dresses, opting instead for men's shoes and messy hair. She supposedly spent only 15 minutes a day on her appearance, which for a 17th century queen was basically an act of war against the fashion industry. She was an intellectual powerhouse who slept only 3 or 4 hours a night, and the rest of her time studying philosophy with René Descartes. In fact, she reportedly killed Descartes by forcing him to wake up at 5 a.m. in the freezing Scandinavian winter to give her lessons. His French lungs just couldn't handle the Scandinavian drafts. But the real royal meltdown came when the court started pressuring her to marry and produce an heir. Christina's response was essentially a 17th century absolutely not. She found the idea of marriage repulsive. So, in a move that shocked all of Europe, she simply quit. She abdicated the throne, dressed in men's clothes, changed her name to Count Dona, and rode off to Rome to live a life of art, scandal, and hanging out with the Pope. She was a king who became a queen who lived like a nobleman. Now, if Christina was a model of intellectual intensity, our next stop, the British Georgians, represented a different kind of dynastic weirdness, specifically the kind that involves a lot of food and a very, very confused King George III. We've all heard that King George III went mad. For a long time, people thought it was just the stress of losing the American colonies, because let's be honest, losing a whole continent is a lot for one ego to handle. But modern science suggests it likely was porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that turned his urine blue and his mind into a kaleidoscope of chaos. During his episodes, George would talk until he literally foamed at the mouth. He once spoke for 24 hours straight without stopping. He would address oak trees as if they were the king of Prussia. He was even seen trying to handshake a tree branch. It's a sad, quiet image, a man who ruled an empire, wandering around his gardens trying to have a diplomatic conversation with a shrub. And then there was his son, George IV, who was the physical embodiment of spoiled. If the Habsburgs were inbred, the Prince Regent was just overfed. He was obsessed with his own image but couldn't stop eating. He wore corsets so tight that they reportedly made him faint. His wedding night was a disaster of legendary proportions. He took one look at his bride, Caroline of Brunswick, and whispered to his valet, "Harris, I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He spent the majority of his wedding night passed out under the fireplace grate. Caroline, for her part, wasn't impressed either, remarking that he was nothing like as handsome as his portrait. It was a marriage made in a very expensive, very drunk version of hell. George spent the rest of his life trying to divorce her, banning her from his coronation, and spending enough money on gold-plated furniture to fund a small country. He was the half-baked potato of the British line, soft, expensive, and ultimately a bit of a mess.
So let's leave the brandy-soaked antics of the Georgians behind and drift further back in time. We're going to look at the sad, sickly, and spoiled world of the medieval and Renaissance royal nurseries. Because if you think being a royal adult was a genetic gamble, being a royal child was essentially a high-stakes game of, will I make it to 10? In these drafty stone palaces, a royal infant was treated as both a deity and a biological experiment. From the moment they were born, they were surrounded by a small army of people, wet nurses, rockers, dry nurses, and fools, all tasked with keeping the precious air breathing. But breathing was a tall order when your doctors thought the best cure for a fever was a crushed emerald mixed with a bit of pigeon dung. Let's talk about the sickly part first. We often imagine these princes and princesses as perfectly coiffed porcelain dolls, but reality was much more moist. Because of the aforementioned inbreeding, many of these children were born with what historians politely call delicate constitutions. Take, for example, the children of Catherine de' Medici and Henry II of France. Catherine was desperate for heirs. She spent years trying every fertility trick in the book, including drinking mule's urine and wearing a girdle made of goat's hair. Eventually, it worked, and she had 10 children, but the Medici curse was real. Most of her sons were frail, prone to fainting, and had a strange habit of bleeding from their noses when they got slightly stressed. Her son, Charles IX, the one who would eventually oversee a massive massacre, was so emotionally unstable that he used to pass the time by hunting animals inside the palace hallways. He was sickly, pale, and constantly sweating. He eventually died at 23, literally sweating blood through his pores. His brother, Henry III, wasn't much better. He was obsessed with his lapdogs and jewelry, and had a habit of dressing them in tiny matching outfits. It was a nursery of high fashion and low immunity. And then there was the spoiled factor. Imagine being 7 years old and having a whipping boy. This was a real job, because a tutor couldn't physically strike a prince, since the prince's body was divine. Whenever the royal child messed up his Latin verbs, a poor local kid was brought in and beaten in front of him. The logic was that the prince would feel so bad for his friend that he'd start studying. In reality, most of these kids just realized they could do whatever they wanted and someone else would pay the price. It's the ultimate recipe for creating a half-baked potato of a tyrant. But perhaps the saddest of all were the political pawns. These were the children who were engaged to be married before they were even out of diapers. We're talking about 4-year-olds being sent across the continent to live in a foreign court where they didn't speak the language, all to seal a treaty that would probably be broken in 6 months anyway. Consider Mary, Queen of Scots. She was 6 days old when she became queen. 6 days! Most of us at 6 days old were struggling with the concept of hands, but Mary was already a head of state. She was sent to the French court at age 5 to be raised as the future Queen of France. She was tiny, red-haired, and incredibly bright, but she was essentially a living, breathing insurance policy. She lived in a world of sugar-coated trauma. She was fed the best food, wore the finest silks, and was told she was the center of the universe, all while being watched by a dozen people who were reporting her every bowel movement back to her mother in Scotland. It's no wonder these people grew up to be eccentric. When your childhood is a mix of being worshipped as a god, watched like a prisoner, and treated with pigeon dung medicine, normalcy isn't really on the menu. The irony of the royal nursery is that despite all the gold and the dozens of servants, these children were often the most neglected people in the kingdom. They were loved as symbols, but rarely as humans. And as we've seen, when those symbols grew up, they tended to leave a very strange, very messy trail through the history books. Let's drift south to France, back to the shimmering, gold-leafed halls of Versailles. We've talked about kings who thought they were made of glass, but now we need to talk about a king who thought he was the literal sun, Louis XIV. Louis was the ultimate theater kid of monarchs. He didn't just rule France, he performed it. But the weirdness here isn't about madness or inbreeding. No, the weirdness of the Sun King was the total, utter lack of privacy. Because when you're the sun, you don't get to have curtains. Imagine waking up every morning at 8 a.m., but instead of hitting the snooze button and staring at your phone, you open your eyes to find 40 to 100 of the highest-ranking nobles in the country standing around your bed. This was the levée. It was a choreographed ceremony where being allowed to hold the king's right sleeve while he put on his shirt was considered the highest honor a man could achieve. People literally spent their entire lives and fortunes just for the chance to hand the king his pants. Because, of course, why wouldn't you want to watch a middle-aged man get dressed while he's nursing a headache? But it didn't stop at shirts and pants. His entire biological existence was a spectacle sport. He ate his meals in front of a crowd. He went to bed in front of a crowd. And most famously, he conducted business while sitting on his close stool, which is a very fancy 17th century term for a toilet. Louis had a series of chronic health issues that would have made anyone else a hermit. He had a truly legendary appetite, which led to, let's call them, digestive adventures. He eventually developed a fistula that required a very experimental and terrifying surgery, which was performed without anesthesia, while half the court probably listened through the door. Because he survived it, the court actually composed a song to celebrate his recovery. That song? It eventually became God Save the King, so the British national anthem actually started as a tribute to a French king's successful rectal surgery. History is funny like that. While Louis was turning his bathroom habits into a high society event, over in Portugal, another royal was having a much more internal struggle, Queen Maria I. They called her Maria the Pious until they started calling her Maria the Mad. She was a deeply religious woman who became convinced that her soul was being dragged to hell because of the sins of her grandfather, the Marquis de Pombal. She didn't just have anxiety, she had full-blown hallucinatory meltdowns. She would wander through the corridors of the palace at night, clad in her nightgown, screaming for the devils to leave her alone. She would shout the name of her dead grandfather, convinced his ghost was haunting the hallways. It got so bad that her son had to take over as regent, and when the Napoleonic Wars broke out, the entire Portuguese court fled to Brazil. Imagine the scene. A fleet of ships carrying the entire government, tons of gold, and a queen who had to be physically restrained because she was screaming that the ship was being chased by demons. She lived her final years in a convent in Rio de Janeiro, a quiet, tragic figure who was lost in a world of religious terrors that no amount of royal status could fix. It's that ironic contrast again. Louis XIV turned his most private, mundane moments into a glorious public ritual of power. Maria I took her most private, internal terrors and turned them into a public spectacle of despair. Both were trapped by their crowns, just in very different ways. And speaking of being trapped, let's float over to a king who was literally trapped by his own body and a very strange set of dietary requirements. Part 8. The King Who Ate a Kingdom's Worth of Cream. Let's float back to Sweden for a moment. We've seen the brilliance of Krista, but now we have to deal with the sheer culinary commitment of King Adolf Frederick. If there was an award for the most on-brand way for a spoiled monarch to exit the stage, Adolf Frederick would take the gold medal. He wasn't a bad guy, really. In fact, he was known as a pretty chill king. He enjoyed making clocks and snuff boxes, a man of simple mechanical hobbies. But in 1771, he decided to have a little dinner. And by a little dinner, I mean a meal that would have made a Roman emperor pause for a second. His final menu consisted of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and boiled meats. That's already a lot for one human stomach to process, but Adolf Frederick had a sweet tooth that bordered on legendary. For dessert, he ordered semla. Now, a semla is a traditional Swedish bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream. Usually you have one, maybe two if you're feeling rebellious. Adolf Frederick ate 14. He served them in bowls of hot milk, and he just kept going. He ate until his digestive system essentially filed for divorce. He died that same night of digestive problems, which is the 18th century way of saying his stomach finally gave the ghost. He's remembered in Swedish history books as the king who ate himself to death. It's an ironic, slightly greasy end for a man whose reign was otherwise quite forgettable. But while Adolf Frederick was busy with his buns, let's drift over to a different kind of obsession, one that wasn't about food, but about the divinity of the bloodline. We're moving to the east, to the imperial court of Japan. For centuries, the imperial Japanese emperors were considered literal living gods. They were the descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. And when you're a god, you don't exactly live like a normal person. The secret buried in the dirt here wasn't a body, but the emperor himself, hidden away behind a series of screens and rituals. In the Heian period, the emperor was so pure that his feet weren't supposed to touch the ground. He was carried everywhere. He lived in a world of poetry, incense, and incredibly complex clothing, sometimes wearing up to 12 layers of silk robes at once. He was essentially a beautiful golden prisoner. Because the bloodline was everything, the inbreeding was, as you can expect, intense. To keep the divinity concentrated, the imperial family often married within the clan for generations. This led to many of the... Let's drift back towards Central Europe, specifically into the alpine shadows of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We've talked about physical deformities and digestive disasters, but now we need to talk about the tragic beauty. This is the story of Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. If there were ever a royal who was the patron saint of "I'd rather be literally anywhere else," it was Sisi. She was married off to Emperor Franz Joseph when she was just 16. He was her cousin because, as we've established, European royals had a very limited Rolodex. Franz Joseph was a man of cold duty and rigid schedules. Sisi was a free spirit who liked riding horses and writing poetry. It was a match made in a very elegant, gold-plated freezer. Sisi became obsessed with her own beauty as a form of armor. She was famous for her hair, which reached down to her heels and took 3 hours a day to brush. She had it washed with a mixture of raw eggs and cognac, which sounds like a recipe for a very expensive hangover, but apparently it worked. She was so obsessed with her waistline that she practiced extreme fasting, often living on nothing but thin broth and orange juice. She even had herself sewn into her leather riding habits so there wouldn't be a single wrinkle. But behind the cognac hair and the tiny waist was a woman who was profoundly, deeply sad. She hated the Viennese court, which she called her gilded cage. She spent decades traveling the world, trying to outrun her own shadow. She refused to sit for portraits after the age of 30 because she didn't want the world to see her age. She wore a heavy black veil and carried a fan to hide her face from the public. She was a ghost who was still breathing. The tragedy reached its peak when her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was found dead in a hunting lodge in Mayerling alongside his teenage mistress. It was a double suicide, a romantic disaster that shattered the empire and Sisi's heart. For the rest of her life, she wore only black. She wandered the Mediterranean on her yacht, looking for a peace that her divine bloodline just wouldn't allow her to have. And speaking of alpine shadows and tragic ends, we have to look at Sisi's favorite cousin, Ludwig II of Bavaria, better known as Mad King Ludwig. Ludwig was the ultimate theater kid with a kingdom's budget. He hated politics. He hated Munich. He hated the fact that he was a king during a time when kings were starting to become obsolete. So he decided to build his own reality. He poured the entire Bavarian treasury into building fairy tale castles like Neuschwanstein, the castle that would later inspire the Disney logo. Ludwig was a lonely, eccentric man who preferred the company of Wagner's operas to actual people. He would have elaborate dinners served for invisible guests, like the ghost of Marie Antoinette. He would travel through the snow in a golden sleigh, dressed in 18th century costumes, looking like a man who had accidentally wandered out of a dream and couldn't find his way back. His government eventually got tired of him spending all their money on turrets and swan-shaped chairs. They had him declared insane by a doctor who hadn't even examined him. A few days later, Ludwig was found dead in waist-deep water in Lake Starnberg, along with the doctor who had diagnosed him. To this day, nobody knows if it was a suicide, an accident, or a very convenient murder.
But there's a haunting irony in it. The man who tried to hide from the world in a fairy tale castle ended up as a dark mystery at the bottom of a cold lake. It's a pattern we see over and over. These royals were given everything: the gold, the titles, the cognac hair treatments, but they were often the most isolated people on the planet. They were buried by their own status long before they ever reached the dirt. So as you drift off to sleep, just remember, your life might not have gold-leafed ceilings or a regiment of giant soldiers, but at least nobody is standing around your bed watching you put on your socks. And honestly, that's the real royal treatment. Sweet dreams. Let's drift back to Spain for one last story, because if we're talking about emotional meltdowns and dynastic weirdness, we can't possibly ignore Joanna of Castile. History knows her by a much more evocative, much more in-kind name: Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Joanna was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the same power couple who sent Columbus to find a shortcut to India. She was brilliant, beautiful, and unfortunately for her, she was a woman with a claim to the throne in a world run by men who wanted it. She fell in love with her husband, Philip the Handsome, and when I say madly, I mean it in the historical, literal sense. Philip was, by all accounts, a bit of a 15th century player. He was charming, he was handsome, obviously, and he was chronically unfaithful. Joanna did not take this well. She would fly into rages, hunting down his mistresses in the palace hallways. But the real weirdness started when Philip died unexpectedly at the age of 28. Joanna was devastated. She refused to let his body be buried. For months and then years, she traveled across the Spanish countryside with Philip's lead-lined coffin in tow. Imagine the scene: a grieving queen traveling only at night because she said a widow should not be seen in the light of the sun, accompanied by a flickering line of torchbearers and a rotting king in a box. She would occasionally have the coffin opened so she could kiss Philip's feet and check to make sure he hadn't been stolen. She refused to let any women near the procession, terrified that even in death, Philip might find someone else to flirt with. She was eventually locked away in a windowless room in the castle of Tordesillas for 47 years. Her father and then her son, the Emperor Charles V, kept her locked away there so they could rule in her name. They told the world she was mad, and while she was certainly traumatized, many historians think her madness was a very convenient political tool. She spent half a century in the dark, listening to the bells of the nearby convent, a queen who was buried alive long before she ever reached the dirt. It's a haunting contrast to the Sun King we talked about earlier. While Louis lived in a world of too much light and too many people, Joanna lived in a world of total silence and shadow. One was a god, the other was a ghost. As we close the book on these dysfunctional dynasties tonight, we see a pattern. The secret buried in the dirt isn't just about bones or DNA. It's the realization that beneath the crowns and the ermine robes, these figures were often struggling with the same things we do: loneliness, heartbreak, and a desperate desire to be seen for who they were, not just what they represented. The dirt eventually claims them all, whether they lie in a cathedral or under a social services office. So, as you take one more deep breath, let the weight of history settle into the mattress. You aren't a king, you aren't a queen, and nobody is waiting to hand you your pants in the morning. And that, my friends, is the real royal treatment. Sweet dreams.